Hello, and welcome to the Sleep Library. Tonight, we are drifting through 100 relaxing facts about Stoicism. There are no adverts in the middle, no sudden sounds, and nothing you need to remember. Let the ideas arrive slowly, like the first quiet hour of evening. If you fall asleep before the end, that is perfectly all right. These words will still be here, waiting softly, whenever you return. Stoicism is often described as ancient wisdom, but it began in a much more ordinary place. People trying to stay steady while money, health, reputation, and power moved around them. It was never about having no feelings. It was about not being carried away by every passing wave. Wherever you are resting tonight, let these old ideas settle beside you like a familiar book on a nightstand. There is nothing to solve, nothing to fix. Just a quiet hour with a quiet thought. Let us begin with the first fact. Fact 1. Stoicism began not as a theory of coldness, but as a practice of steadiness. The early Stoics met in a painted porch in Athens, a long colonnade decorated with murals of historical battles and mythological scenes. It was a public space, open to the noise of the marketplace, to passers-by, to anyone who wanted to stop and listen. Philosophy was not hidden away in private rooms or elite academies. It was spoken out loud, in the open air where life was actually happening. The porch was called the Stoa Poikile, and from that ordinary meeting place, an extraordinary tradition was born, one that would outlast empires. Fact 2. The founder of Stoicism was a man named Zeno, and his path to philosophy began with a shipwreck. Zeno was a merchant from Citium, a Greek city on the coast of modern-day Cyprus. He traded in purple dye, the color of royalty and wealth. On one voyage, his ship went down near Athens, and he lost everything: his cargo, his fortune, his livelihood. He washed ashore with nothing. Wandering through the city, he found himself in a bookshop, where he heard the works of Socrates being read aloud. He asked the bookseller where he could find someone like Socrates. At that moment, the cynic philosopher Crates happened to walk by. The bookseller pointed, and Zeno's new life began. Sometimes the loss of everything is what clears the space for something else. Fact 3. The name Stoicism has nothing to do with being stone-faced or unemotional. It comes simply from the Stoa Poikile, the painted porch, where Zeno and his followers gathered. They were originally called Zenonians, after their founder. But Zeno discouraged any cult of personality around himself. Over time, people began to refer to them as the philosophers of the porch, the Stoics. The name stuck. And so a philosophy that would teach generations about inner freedom took its name from a piece of architecture, a quiet colonnade where anyone could stop and think. Fact 4. In the ancient Stoic school, philosophy was understood as having three interconnected parts: logic, physics, and ethics. They used metaphors to explain how these fit together. One metaphor was an egg. Logic is the shell that protects, ethics is the white that nourishes, and physics is the yolk at the center. Another was a garden. Logic is the fence that marks the boundary. Physics is the soil and the trees, and ethics is the fruit that grows. The point was that all three were necessary. You could not have one without the others. Ethics was the goal, learning how to live well, but it was supported by understanding the world and thinking clearly about it. Fact 5. Before Zeno founded his own school, he studied under Crates of Thebes, a philosopher from the Cynic tradition. The Cynics believed in living with almost nothing, rejecting social conventions, wealth, and comfort entirely. Diogenes, the most famous cynic, famously lived in a barrel. Zeno was drawn to the cynic ideal of simplicity, but he found their approach too extreme, too confrontational. He wanted something more measured, something a person could actually practice while living a normal life in a city, among other people. Stoicism was in many ways the Cynic philosophy, tempered, still honest, still disciplined, but gentler around the edges. A philosophy you could bring home. Fact 6. Zeno's successor as head of the Stoic school was a man named Cleanthes. He was not born into privilege or intellect. Cleanthes was a boxer in his youth, and later a manual laborer. He worked through the night, drawing water from wells and carrying it to gardens so that he could spend his days studying philosophy. For a time he was so poor that he could not afford paper. He would write Zeno's teachings on oyster shells and the shoulder blades of oxen. He was mocked by some of the more polished students in Athens, who called him slow. But Cleanthes was steady. He led the school for 32 years. His story is a quiet reminder that philosophy does not belong to the quick or the wealthy. It belongs to the persistent. Fact 7. The third head of the Stoic school was Chrysippus, and he is often credited with saving the philosophy from being absorbed by rival schools. He was a prolific writer. Some say he wrote over 700 books, though nearly all of them have been lost. Chrysippus took the scattered teachings of Zeno and Cleanthes and gave them structure, rigor, and logical precision. He was the system builder. Without him, Stoicism might have dissolved into vague advice. With him, it became a coherent framework for living. One ancient saying went, "If there had been no Chrysippus, there would have been no Stoa." A quiet tribute, passed down through the centuries, to a man who spent his life organizing ideas so others could find clarity. Fact 8. When Stoicism traveled from Athens to Rome, it found particularly fertile ground. The Romans were practical people, less interested in abstract theory, and more concerned with how to govern, how to lead, how to endure. Two philosophers, Panaetius and Posidonius, adapted Stoic ideas for a Roman audience. They softened some of the harder edges, emphasized duty and public service, and made the philosophy speak to the concerns of statesmen and soldiers. What had started in a Greek porch now found itself in the Senate, the military camp, and the private study of Roman nobles. The philosophy was becoming portable, a companion for people who carried great responsibility. Fact 9. The three most famous Stoic writers, Seneca, Epictetus, and Marcus Aurelius, never met one another. They were separated by time, geography, and circumstance. Seneca was a Roman playwright and statesman in the 1st century, serving as advisor to the Emperor Nero. Epictetus was born a slave in the eastern provinces, gained his freedom, and taught philosophy in a small school in Greece. Marcus Aurelius was a Roman emperor in the 2nd century, writing private notes to himself, while commanding armies on the frontier. A statesman, a former slave, an emperor. 3 lives with almost nothing outwardly in common, yet they spoke the same quiet language. That language has outlasted all 3 of them. Fact 10. Stoicism endured as a living philosophical school for nearly 500 years. From Zeno in the 3rd century BCE through the death of Marcus Aurelius in 180 CE, and in various forms beyond. 5 centuries is a long time for any idea to stay coherent. Empires rose and fell during that span. Athens declined. Rome grew, then began its own slow unraveling. Through all of it, People kept meeting in rooms and porches, kept reading old texts, kept asking the same question: how to live with steadiness when the world will not stand still. The school itself eventually faded, but the question never did, and the answers they found are still resting here, waiting to be picked up. Fact 11. At the center of Stoic thought is an idea so simple that it almost sounds too modest to be philosophy. It is called the dichotomy of control. Some things are up to us and some things are not. Our opinions, our desires, our aversions, our intentions, these are within our power. Our bodies, our reputations, our possessions, the actions of others, these are not. Epictetus opened his handbook with exactly this distinction. He did not say that the things outside our control do not matter. He said that if we confuse the two categories, we will suffer. We will spend our energy gripping tightly to things that were never ours to hold. The quiet work of Stoicism begins right here, learning to tell the difference. Fact 12. One of the most quietly radical ideas in Stoicism is that it is not events that disturb us, but our judgments about them. A rainy day is just weather. A critical comment is just sound waves. A delayed train is just a machine arriving later than expected. The distress does not come from the thing itself. It comes from the story we tell ourselves about the thing. This is not to say that some events are not genuinely painful. The Stoics knew grief, loss, and hardship intimately, but they observed that two people could face the same event and respond very differently. The difference was always in the judgment, and judgment is something we can work with. Fact 13. The Stoics used a word that is often translated as virtue, but the Greek term is arete. It does not quite mean virtue in the moralistic sense. It is closer to excellence, the quality of a thing fulfilling its purpose well. A good knife cuts well. A good eye sees clearly. A good human being in the Stoic view is one who reasons well, who acts justly, who meets life with the steadiness that is proper to a rational creature. Arete is not about being perfect. It is about being fully what you are in the best sense. It is a quiet, ongoing orientation, not a final destination. Fact 14. The Stoics believed in something they called logos, an organizing principle, a rational order that runs through the universe. They saw it in the movement of the stars, the growth of plants, the patterns of cause and effect, and they believed that human reason is a fragment of this larger reason. We are not separate from the universe looking in. We are part of it. When a person thinks clearly, when they act in harmony with what is real, they are aligning themselves with the logos. This is not a cold, mechanical idea. It is closer to the feeling of being in tune, of recognizing that you belong to something larger than yourself. Fact 15. Perhaps the most misunderstood phrase in Stoicism is live according to nature. It does not mean abandoning civilization and returning to the forest. To the Stoics, nature meant the rational order of the cosmos and the specific nature of a human being. Since humans are reasoning animals, living according to nature means living according to reason, thinking clearly, acting fairly, accepting the way things are rather than fighting reality. It is not a call to be primitive. It is a call to be rational in the deepest sense, to stop wasting energy on contradictions and to move with the grain of the world rather than against it. Fact 16. Another Stoic term that has drifted far from its original meaning is apatheia. In modern English, it sounds like apathy, a lack of feeling, a shrug, a dull indifference. But in Greek, apatheia meant freedom from being controlled by passions. Not the absence of emotion, but the absence of emotional slavery. A Stoic could feel sorrow, joy, affection, and longing. But they aimed not to be swept away by these feelings, not to have their judgment overturned by a surge of anger or a wave of fear. It is the difference between being visited by an emotion and being possessed by it. The door opens, the feeling enters, but you remain seated. You do not hand over the keys. Fact 17. In Stoic psychology, every spirit experience begins with an impression, a sound, an image, a thought that rises unbidden. These impressions come to us, whether we want them or not. They are the raw material of consciousness, arriving constantly like waves. But between the impression and our reaction, there is a small, crucial gap. In that gap sits the faculty of assent. We can agree with the impression, or we can refuse it. Someone insults you. The impression says, "You have been harmed." But you can pause. You can examine the impression. You can ask, is that really true? And in that pause, freedom lies. The Stoics practiced noticing the gap and widening it. Fact 18. Memento mori. Remember that you will die. This phrase has followed Stoicism through the centuries, and it is easy to misunderstand as morbid or dark. But the Stoics meant it as a clarifying practice. When you remember that time is limited, the trivial loses its grip. Arguments that would consume an afternoon suddenly seem less important. The desire to impress strangers fades. The impulse to put off what matters softens. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself each morning that he might not see the evening. Not to frighten himself, but to wake himself up. Death in this view is not a threat. It is a quiet companion that helps you see what is actually yours. Fact 19. A related but distinct idea is amor fati, the love of fate. This phrase is more commonly associated with Nietzsche, but its spirit runs deep in Stoicism. It is not just accepting what happens. It is embracing it. Not resignation with a sigh, but a kind of glad willingness. The Stoics believe that whatever happens is part of the larger rational order, woven into the fabric of cause and effect. To love fate is to say, I do not merely tolerate this, I affirm it. This is much harder than acceptance. It asks for a kind of generosity toward reality, a trust that even difficulty has its place. It is a practice more than a feeling, something you return to in the quiet moments, turning the day's events over and finding, perhaps, a small glimmer of assent. Fact 20. Premeditatio malorum is the practice of imagining what could go wrong. At first, this sounds like a recipe for anxiety, but the Stoics used it for the opposite purpose. By picturing loss, illness, poverty, or disgrace in advance, they reduced the shock of these things should they arrive. More than that, they realized that most of what they feared was survivable. Seneca, writing from exile, had already imagined exile long before it happened. When the guards came, the scene was familiar. He had already lived it in his mind. The practice is not about dwelling on the worst. It is about draining the worst of its power to surprise you. A small ritual of courage, done in advance, in the safety of a quiet room. Fact 21. Before Zeno founded the Stoa, he traveled to Delphi to consult the famous oracle. He asked a direct question, what is the best way to live? The priestess gave him an answer that must have sounded strange at first. She said, take on the color of the dead. The meaning was not immediately obvious, but Zeno came to understand it. The dead have already lived. Their experiences are preserved in books, in stories, in the records of what worked and what failed. To take on the color of the dead is to learn from those who came before, to absorb their wisdom rather than starting from scratch. Zeno took the advice seriously. He began reading the philosophers of the past, and in their words he found the seeds of what would become Stoicism. The oracle's cryptic phrase turned out to be a quiet instruction, humility, and the willingness to listen to voices that had already fallen silent. Fact 22. Cleanthes, the second head of the Stoic school, was once summoned to appear in court. His neighbors had noticed his unusual way of life. He worked through the night, studied by day, and seemed to live on very little. They found it suspicious. In Athens, a citizen could be charged with living idly, with contributing nothing to the city. Cleanthes arrived at the court not with a lawyer, but with witnesses, the men whose gardens he watered, the people who had seen him laboring through the dark hours. He showed the court his calloused hands. The judges were so impressed by his industry that they not only acquitted him, but reportedly awarded him a small sum of money from the public treasury. Cleanthes accepted it modestly and continued his work. The man they suspected of idleness was, in truth, one of the hardest working people in the city. Fact 23. Chrysippus, the great logician of the early Stoa, is said to have died in a manner that almost defies belief. The story goes that he was at a feast when he saw a donkey eating figs from his table. He found the sight so absurd, so unexpectedly comical, that he called out for someone to give the donkey some wine to wash down the fruit. He then began laughing uncontrollably, and he laughed so hard that he collapsed and died. Whether this story is true or merely a legend told by later writers, it reveals something about how the Stoics were remembered. Even their most rigorous thinker, the man who built their logical system, was not portrayed as grim or cold. He was remembered, strangely and fondly, as a man who could be undone by the simple sight of a donkey eating figs. Fact 24. Seneca wrote one of his most famous works, On the Shortness of Life, while he was in exile. He had been banished to the island of Corsica by the Emperor Claudius, accused of an affair that may or may not have happened. Corsica was rugged, remote, far from the political life Seneca was accustomed to, and in that enforced stillness he composed a meditation on time that still resonates today. His central argument was quiet but devastating. Life is not actually short. We make it short by wasting so much of it on pursuits that do not matter, on people we do not respect, on worries that never materialize. He wrote it not as a lecture to others, but as a self-examination. He was looking at his own wasted hours. The exile that seemed like a punishment became, in some sense, the space where he finally had time to think about time. Fact 25. Epictetus was born a slave in Hierapolis, a city in what is now modern-day Turkey. His name itself tells us something. Epictetus, in Greek, simply means acquired or purchased. He was owned by a man named Epaphroditus, a freedman who had risen to become a secretary to the Emperor Nero. Somewhere in those years of servitude, Epictetus was introduced to philosophy. His owner allowed him to study under Musonius Rufus, one of the great Stoic teachers of the time. Eventually, Epictetus gained his freedom. But he never forgot what it felt like to own nothing, to be treated as property, to have no control over his external circumstances. His entire philosophy would become a meditation on a single hard-won insight. Freedom is not a legal status. It is an inner condition. Fact 26. There is a well-known story about Epictetus and his leg. According to the account, his master Epaphroditus was once twisting his leg as a form of punishment or cruel amusement. Epictetus remained calm. He said in a steady voice, "If you keep twisting, it will break." Epaphroditus continued, and the leg did indeed break. Epictetus then added, without anger, "I told you it would break." Some scholars doubt the literal truth of this story. But whether it happened exactly this way or not, the tale survived because it captured something essential about the man. He did not flinch. He did not beg. He simply stated the facts and accepted the outcome. This was not passivity. It was clarity. Fact 27. The most famous Stoic text, the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, was never meant to be read by anyone else. Marcus wrote it for himself, in fragments, during the last decade of his life. He was emperor of Rome, stationed at military camps along the Danube frontier, leading campaigns against Germanic tribes. The nights were cold. The work was relentless. And in the quiet moments between duties, he wrote private reminders. Do not let anger win. Remember that others are also struggling. Keep your thoughts clear. Stay kind. The original title was simply to himself. There is no structure, no argument, no polished rhetoric. It is more like overhearing someone talk to their own soul, and perhaps that is why it has lasted so long. Fact 28. Seneca's death is one of the most documented in ancient philosophy. In the year 65, the Emperor Nero ordered him to commit suicide, accusing him of involvement in a conspiracy. Seneca accepted the sentence without protest. He was in his 60s by then, and he had spent years writing about how to face death with dignity. Now the theory had to become practice. He gathered his friends, comforted his wife Paulina, and tried to reassure those around him. The actual death was slow and painful. His veins did not open easily, and he reportedly took hemlock as well. But the witnesses described his composure. He had written about this moment many times. When it finally arrived, he met it quietly, talking with his friends until the very end, dictating his last thoughts. The words are lost, but the image remains. Fact 29. Cato the Younger was not a philosopher in the formal sense, but the Stoics revered him as the closest thing to a living sage. He lived during the final years of the Roman Republic, when corruption and political violence were tearing the old institutions apart. Cato refused to compromise. He would not accept bribes. He would not bend to pressure from powerful men. When Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon and overthrew the Republic, Cato resisted until the very end. Trapped in the city of Utica, with no chance of escape, he chose to take his own life rather than live under what he considered tyranny. Even his enemies admired him. Seneca wrote about Cato often, holding him up as a model of integrity. The difficult truth about Cato is that his virtue did not save the Republic. But that, in a way, is the Stoic point. You do what is right because it is right, not because it guarantees a happy outcome. Fact 30. Musonius Rufus is not a household name, but he taught Epictetus, and his influence runs deeper than most people realize. He was a Roman knight who taught philosophy publicly, which was unusual for someone of his social standing. He believed that philosophy should address everyday life: what to eat, how to dress, how to raise children, how to treat servants. One of his most striking teachings was that women should study philosophy on equal terms with men. In a society where women were largely confined to domestic roles, this was genuinely radical. He argued that women, like men, possess reason, and therefore they need the same training in how to live well. The idea did not transform Roman society overnight, but it was spoken, recorded, and preserved, a small seed planted in unforgiving soil. Fact 31. Stoicism suffers from a misunderstanding so common that it has almost become the default definition. Many people believe that being stoic means having no feelings, a kind of emotional numbness, a face carved from stone. This is not what the Stoics taught. They did not aim to eliminate emotions. They aimed to transform them. Fear could become caution. Anger could become a sense of injustice that motivates constructive action. Grief could become a quiet gratitude for what was had. The goal was never emptiness. It was clarity. A person who feels nothing is not a Stoic. A person who feels deeply but is not ruled by those feelings, that is closer to the mark. The difference matters, and it has been quietly misunderstood for centuries. Fact 32. Connected to this is the idea that a Stoic should not cry, that tears are a failure of composure. But Seneca, in one of his letters of consolation, addressed this directly. He had lost a friend, and he wrote about grief not as an enemy but as a natural response. He said that tears should be allowed to flow. The Stoic does not force their eyes dry. What they avoid is the performance of grief, the exaggeration that some cultures demanded, wailing, tearing clothes, beating the chest. Those were displays, and they often prolonged pain rather than releasing it. But private tears, honest tears, the kind that come in the quiet of the night when no one is watching, those are human. And Stoicism has always had room for what is human. Fact 33. Another misunderstanding paints Stoicism as a philosophy of passivity, of sitting back and accepting whatever happens without lifting a finger. But the Stoics were not quietists. Marcus Aurelius was an emperor who spent years on military campaign. Seneca was a statesman who managed imperial affairs. Cato fought and died for the Republic. The Stoic principle is not do nothing. It is do what is right and do not attach your peace of mind to the outcome. You act with all your energy, but you hold the results loosely. This is not passivity. It is engagement without desperation. The difference is subtle but enormous. One person fights while clinging to a specific result and suffers when it does not come. Another fights with the same effort but sleeps soundly either way. Fact 34. The Stoic claim that everything happens for a reason can be misread as a kind of forced optimism, a denial of genuine tragedy. The Stoics did not say that every event is good. They said that every event can be used well. There is a world of difference between these two statements. Losing a loved one is not good. Being betrayed is not good. Suffering is real. But within every difficult situation, there is an opportunity not to erase the pain, but to practice courage, patience, compassion, or resilience. The event itself may be terrible, but your response to it can still be virtuous. This is not toxic positivity. It is a quiet refusal to let suffering have the last word. Fact 35. Happiness in the Stoic sense is not a cheerful mood. It is not excitement or pleasure or the absence of difficulty. The Greek word they used, eudaimonia, has a deeper resonance. It means something closer to flourishing, to living well, to having an inner life that is in good order. A person can experience eudaimonia even while enduring physical pain or grief or hardship. The external circumstances do not determine it. What determines it is the condition of the soul, whether you are acting with wisdom, courage, justice, and moderation. This is a much quieter kind of happiness than the one we are usually taught to chase. It does not shout. It does not sparkle. It simply holds steady. Fact 36. One of the most persistent critiques of Stoicism is that it seems to reject wealth, success, and comfort. But the Stoics did not forbid these things. They simply refused to depend on them. Seneca was one of the richest men in Rome. He owned estates, investments, and luxuries, and he was aware of the contradiction. He wrote about it openly, admitting that he was not a sage, that he still had attachments, that he was still learning. His advice was not to throw everything away, but to hold it as if it were borrowed. A wealthy person could practice Stoicism by being ready to lose everything without breaking. A poor person could practice it by not envying the rich. The philosophy was for both, and it met each where they stood. Fact 37. The phrase, "grin and bear it," is sometimes mistaken for Stoicism, but it misses the point. Suffering in silence, without reflection, is not Stoic practice. The Stoics did not suppress pain, they examined it. They asked, "What is this pain teaching me? Is there something here I can change? If not, how can I change my relationship to it?" This is an active process, not a clenched jaw. It is closer to a conversation with oneself than to Stoic silence. Epictetus would say that the goal is not to endure blindly, but to understand clearly, so that the endurance becomes lighter, less of a struggle. Understanding transforms the weight. Silence alone does not. Fact 38. Because the Stoics spoke so often about inner life, it is easy to assume they were indifferent to science and the outer world. But the ancient Stoics were deeply interested in physics, in how the universe works. They studied astronomy, biology, meteorology. They believed that understanding nature was part of understanding the logos, the rational order. Posidonius, one of the later Stoic teachers, was known for his geographical and astronomical research. The inner and outer worlds were not separate domains. They were connected. Knowing how the stars moved and knowing how your own mind moved were part of the same inquiry, two facets of a single pursuit. Fact 39. There is no Stoic saint. This is worth saying plainly, because it can be tempting to imagine Marcus Aurelius or Epictetus as perfect beings who never stumbled. But the Stoics themselves were the first to admit their failures. Seneca confessed his struggles with anger and ambition. Marcus wrote reminders about patience because he kept losing it. The philosophy is not a trophy you earn once and display forever. It is a daily practice, often messy, full of setbacks. The goal is not to become flawless. The goal is to keep returning to the path again and again without self-hatred. The only failure in the Stoic view is to stop trying entirely. Fact 40. The Meditations of Marcus Aurelius is often sold today as a handbook of ancient wisdom, a self-help classic. But when Marcus wrote it, he was not trying to help anyone else. The book has no chapters, no organized themes, no polished arguments. It is a collection of fragments, written in the early morning or late at night, often repeating the same points, because he had not yet mastered them. He reminded himself not to be angry with difficult people, not to fear death, not to be distracted by pleasure. Over and over. The repetition is not a literary flaw. It is the sound of a man working on himself, patiently in the dark, far from the gaze of any audience. That rawness is what makes it real. Fact 41. Marcus Aurelius had a morning ritual that he described in the Meditations. When he woke, before the duties of the empire pressed in, he would remind himself of the kinds of people he was likely to encounter that day. The meddlesome, the ungrateful, the arrogant, the dishonest, the jealous. He did not list them to feel superior. He listed them to prepare his own mind. He reminded himself that these people were not evil by nature but misguided, acting from ignorance rather than malice. He reminded himself that he too had faults. And he reminded himself that no one can truly harm you unless you let them, because your character remains your own. This quiet preparation took only a few moments, but it set the tone for the entire day. The emperor, alone in his tent or his chamber, steadying himself before the world rushed in. Fact 42. The Stoics practiced a form of evening reflection that served as a gentle counterpart to the morning preparation. Seneca described it as a kind of daily court, where he put his own actions on trial. He would ask himself 3 questions. What did I do well today? What did I do poorly? What did I leave undone? He was not looking to punish himself. He was looking to learn. The tone was calm, not accusatory. A mistake recognized was a mistake already half corrected. This practice, done in the stillness before sleep, allowed the day's events to settle. It turned experience into something useful, like compost broken down to feed new growth. The room would be quiet, the candle would be low, and the mind would slowly release the day. Fact 43. Food in Stoic practice was a subject of genuine philosophical attention. Musonius Rufus, the teacher of Epictetus, wrote about eating with a clarity that can feel almost startling. He said that the purpose of food is to sustain the body, not to provide entertainment. He recommended simple meals eaten slowly and gratefully. But he did not demand extreme asceticism. A person could enjoy a good meal, he said, as long as the enjoyment did not become the point. The difference is subtle but practical. You can taste the food, you can appreciate it. But when the meal is over, you let it go. You do not spend the next hour thinking about what you ate or planning what you will eat next. The appetite is satisfied and the mind moves on. This is not deprivation. It is freedom from a quiet kind of craving that can occupy more space than we realize. Fact 44. Live each day as if it were your last is advice that appears in many traditions, but the Stoics gave it a particular shape. They did not mean that you should quit your job, spend all your savings, or chase thrills. They meant something quieter. If today were your last, would you waste it on petty resentments? Would you scroll past the people you love? Would you put off the conversation that matters? The practice is not about urgency in the frantic sense. It is about presence. Marcus Aurelius put it simply, you could leave life right now. Let that determine what you do and say and think. The thought is not meant to frighten. It is meant to cut through the fog of postponement that settles over so many ordinary days. Fact 45. The Stoics cared about the body, but they assigned it a specific role. It was a tool, not a treasure. Musonius Rufus encouraged physical training. Epictetus spoke of keeping the body in working order, like a sailor maintaining a ship. But they warned against obsession, building muscle for vanity, starving oneself for beauty, measuring self-worth by appearance. All of this was, in their view, a confusion of priorities. The body is the vessel that carries the mind. It deserves care but not worship. A healthy body supports clear thinking. A neglected body can distract the mind with preventable pain. The balance was simple and practical. Treat the body with respect, and then turn your attention back to what matters more. Fact 46. Insults, in the Stoic view, are not things that happen to you. They are things that happen in your mind. When someone insults you, they have made a sound with their mouth. That is all. The sting comes from your own judgment, from the belief that their words have power, that their opinion defines you, that you have been diminished. Epictetus had a disarmingly simple technique for handling insults. If someone says something cruel about you, he suggested, ask yourself whether they know all of your faults. The answer is almost certainly no. If they knew the full extent of your shortcomings, they would have said much worse. This thought is not self-deprecation. It is perspective. It shrinks the insult by reminding you that the person throwing it does not even have the full picture. And in that small gap of humor, the sting fades. Fact 47. One of the most distinctive Stoic practices is called the view from above. The idea is to imagine yourself rising slowly into the sky, looking down at your street, your city, your country, the continent, the whole turning planet. From that height, individual lives become tiny specks. The things that loomed so large, a difficult email, an awkward conversation, a minor failure, shrink to their true proportions. This is not an exercise in nihilism or meaninglessness. It is an exercise in relief. The Stoics used it to remind themselves that most of what they worried about would be forgotten in a generation. The practice does not make life insignificant. It makes anxiety smaller. When you return to your own perspective, the problems are still there, but they feel lighter. The view from above is a way of taking the weight off for a moment, of seeing your troubles from the calm distance of the stars. Fact 48. Seneca recommended a practice that sounds uncomfortable, but contains a quiet wisdom. He called it practicing poverty. He suggested that a few times a year, a person should live for a day or two on the simplest food in the plainest conditions, wearing the roughest clothes. The goal was not to glorify hardship. It was to answer a question that lurks in the back of the mind. Could I survive if I lost everything? Most people never ask this question because they are afraid of the answer. Seneca believed that facing it directly removed the fear. Once you have spent a few days living on bread and water, the thought of poverty loses its terror. You know from experience that you can endure. That knowledge is a kind of wealth that no one can take from you. Fact 49. Writing, for the Stoics, was not a form of entertainment or a way to build an audience. It was a tool for examining the soul. Marcus Aurelius wrote to himself. Seneca wrote letters to friends that were really meditations in disguise. Epictetus's teachings were written down by his student Arrian, but the content is full of the raw, spoken energy of a man thinking out loud. The Stoic journal was not a diary of events. It was a record of judgments. What did I react to today? Was my reaction wise or foolish? Did I mistake something outside my control for something within it? The act of writing slowed down the mind enough to see its own patterns. Putting words on the page was like holding up a mirror, not to admire the reflection, but to check what needed cleaning. Fact 50. Before sleep, the Stoics often read a short passage from a philosophical text, not chapters, not hours of study, just a few lines. Seneca recommended ending the day with a thought that could settle in the mind and rest there, like a seed planted in quiet soil. A sentence from Epictetus. A fragment of Heraclitus. A line from one of the old poets. The reading was not for information. It was for formation. It gave the mind something to hold on to as it drifted toward sleep. Something steady. Something true. The book would be closed, the candle extinguished, and the last thought of the day would be not a worry, not a regret, but a quiet word from a voice that had been at peace for a very long time. Fact 51. There is a quiet tension at the heart of Stoicism, one that the ancient thinkers acknowledged and wrestled with. If everything is determined by fate, by the rational unfolding of the logos, do human beings actually have free will? The Stoics answered this question with a careful distinction. They believed that external events are indeed part of a causal chain that stretches back through time, each event linked to the one before it. But your inner response, your judgment, your assent to an impression that belongs to you. The universe may determine what happens to you. It does not determine what you think about what happens to you. That small space of inner freedom was, for the Stoics, absolute and inviolable. No one could enter it without your permission. This is compatibilism before the word existed, a way of holding both ideas at once. The world has its order, and you have your choice. Fact 52. To explain this relationship between fate and freedom, the Stoics used a memorable image. Imagine a dog tied to a moving cart. The cart is going somewhere, and the dog cannot stop it. The dog has two options. It can resist, dig its paws into the ground, fight the rope, and be dragged painfully along the road. Or it can accept the direction of the cart and walk alongside it, moving at the same pace, keeping its dignity intact. In both cases, the destination is the same. The difference is in the quality of the journey. The Stoics saw human beings as the dog and fate as the cart. Resistance brings suffering. Acceptance brings something closer to peace. Not a defeated surrender, but a willing participation in the movement of things. Fact 53. Seneca remains one of the most human of the Stoics because he did not hide his contradictions. He wrote beautiful essays about the dangers of wealth while sitting in one of the largest private fortunes in Rome. He advised others to live simply, while he owned hundreds of citrus wood tables, a luxury item so expensive that it bordered on absurdity. His critics called him a hypocrite, and the charge has echoed down the centuries. But Seneca was aware of the gap between his ideals and his life. He wrote about it openly, without making excuses. He said he was not a wise man, merely someone trying to become one. Someone who could see the target, but had not yet learned to hit it consistently. This honesty, uncomfortable as it is, may be more useful than a flawless example. It shows that the philosophy is big enough to hold people who are still struggling. Fact 54. Amor fati, the love of fate, sounds beautiful in theory. But what does it mean when fate brings something genuinely terrible? The death of a child, a devastating illness, a betrayal that shatters trust. The Stoics did not offer easy answers to these questions. They did not say that such things are secretly good. They said that even in the worst circumstances, a human being can still practice virtue, still be kind, still refuse to let bitterness take root, still maintain an inner life that is not destroyed by outer events. This is not a solution to suffering. It is a way of not letting suffering take more than it already has. Amor fati, in its deepest form, is not about celebrating pain. It is about refusing to let pain define the whole of your existence. Fact 55. A reasonable question to ask of Stoicism is whether its focus on inner peace leads to quietism, to a withdrawal from the work of making the world better. If I am focused on my own judgments, will I still fight against injustice? The Stoic answer was clear. Justice is one of the four cardinal virtues. A Stoic has a duty to act justly, to serve the community, to oppose wrongdoing. Marcus Aurelius spent much of his reign dealing with wars, plagues, and political crises, not meditating in a garden. The inner work was not a substitute for outer action. It was the foundation that made sustained action possible without burnout or despair. A person who cultivates inner steadiness can engage with the world more effectively, not less. Fact 56. The Stoics have sometimes been accused of teaching detachment from loved ones, of loving lightly so as not to be hurt. This is a misunderstanding, but it points to something real. The Stoics did teach that we should remind ourselves that everyone we love is mortal, that every relationship will end, that we hold nothing permanently. This sounds cold, but they meant it as a way of loving more fully, not less. When you remember that a person will not be here forever, you pay more attention to them now. You waste less time on petty arguments. You appreciate what you have while you have it. The Stoic loves deeply, with full knowledge of loss. It is not a guarded love. It is a love that has made peace with the truth. Fact 57. If Stoicism seems like a philosophy for the privileged, for people with leisure time and comfortable lives, the life of Epictetus stands as a quiet rebuttal. He was born enslaved. He had no wealth, no status, no legal rights. His body was not his own. And yet he found in the same philosophy that Marcus Aurelius would later practice in a palace, a source of unshakable freedom. He said that a person can be a slave in body but free in mind. This is not a romanticization of slavery. It is an insistence that even in the most constrained circumstances, a human being retains something that cannot be taken. Epictetus did not choose his external situation, but he chose his response to it, and that choice made him in his own terms freer than many emperors. Fact 58. The Stoic claim that virtue is sufficient for happiness is one of the hardest parts of the philosophy to accept. Can a person truly be happy while being tortured, while watching their family suffer, while losing everything they have ever loved? The Stoics said yes, but they meant something very specific by happiness. They did not mean pleasure or comfort or the absence of pain. They meant eudaimonia, the flourishing of a soul that is living according to reason. They believed that a person could maintain inner order even in the worst external chaos. This is an extreme claim, and the Stoics themselves acknowledged that it described an ideal that almost no one ever reaches. It is a direction, not a destination. A star to navigate by, not a place you expect to arrive. Fact 59. Should children be taught Stoicism? The ancient Stoics did not have a formal curriculum for the young, but Musonius Rufus spoke about education with clarity. He believed that children should be taught to reason well, to distinguish right from wrong, and to develop self-control. But he did not suggest that a 5-year-old should contemplate death. The philosophy was meant to be adapted to the person. A child might learn to share, to be honest, to handle disappointment without collapsing. A teenager might begin to examine their judgments. An adult might take on the deeper practices. Stoicism is not a single weight meant to be lifted all at once. It is a path that meets you where you are, and the terrain changes as you walk. Fact 60. When a loved one dies, Stoicism does not say, "Do not grieve." It says something quieter and stranger. Grieve, but do not add to the grief. The loss itself is real and painful. But on top of that loss, people often add a second layer of suffering. The thought that this should not have happened, that the universe is unfair, that they cannot go on. The Stoic tries to feel the first pain without piling the second on top of it. Tears are natural. The feeling of absence is real. But the story we tell about that absence can either soften the wound or deepen it. The Stoic practice in the face of loss is not to stop feeling. It is to stop telling yourself that reality should have been different. Reality has spoken, and you quietly, slowly learn to live with what it has said. Fact 61. The Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, now one of the most widely read philosophical texts in the world, nearly vanished from history. After Marcus died in 180 CE, his private notebooks somehow survived. They were passed through unknown hands, copied, preserved, and eventually found their way into a monastery in the Byzantine Empire. For centuries, the text existed in a single known manuscript, housed in a library, vulnerable to fire, war, neglect, and decay. One spark, one flood, one careless hand, and the entire work could have been lost forever. The fact that we can still read it today is not a sign of destiny. It is a quiet accident of history, a thread that did not break. Every reader who opens the Meditations is, in some small way, the beneficiary of a long chain of anonymous people who kept the pages safe. Fact 62. One of the most direct modern descendants of Stoicism is cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, a widely used form of psychotherapy. In the 1950s and 1960s, psychologists Albert Ellis and Aaron Beck independently developed approaches that placed thoughts, rather than events, at the center of emotional distress. Both men had read the Stoics. Ellis quoted Epictetus directly, "Men are disturbed not by things, but by the views they take of them." The core idea of CBT is that automatic thoughts and distorted beliefs cause suffering, and that examining these thoughts can bring relief. This is essentially the Stoic theory of impressions, updated with clinical research. The painted porch in Athens and the therapist's office in a modern city are, in this sense, not so far apart. Fact 63. In the early 21st century, Stoicism experienced a quiet revival, and one of the figures most responsible for bringing it to a wide audience is the writer Ryan Holiday. His book, The Obstacle is the Way, took a simple Stoic idea and made it accessible to athletes, entrepreneurs, and people in high-pressure professions. Holiday did not present Stoicism as academic philosophy. He presented it as a practical toolkit for navigating adversity. Some scholars have criticized this popularization as oversimplified. Others have welcomed it as a faithful adaptation. Whatever the judgment, the result is clear. Millions of people who would never have picked up Marcus Aurelius have now encountered Stoic ideas, often at the very moment they needed them most. Fact 64. The influence of Stoicism on Roman governance extended well beyond Marcus Aurelius. The Emperor Hadrian, who ruled before Marcus, was known to consult Stoic advisors. Antoninus Pius, Marcus's adoptive father and predecessor, was described by Marcus himself as a model of Stoic calm and steady leadership. These were not philosophers in the formal sense, but they absorbed Stoic principles through their education and their advisors. The ideal of the ruler as a servant of the people, governed by reason rather than impulse, owes something to this quiet philosophical tradition. Stoicism did not produce perfect emperors, but it gave some of them a language for trying to be better, a set of standards against which they could measure themselves in the privacy of their own thoughts. Fact 65. When Christianity spread through the Roman Empire, it did not erase Stoicism. Instead, the two traditions entered into a long and complicated conversation. Early Christian writers like Tertullian and Augustine read Stoic texts and found much to admire. Seneca was so respected by some Christians that a forged correspondence between Seneca and St. Paul circulated in the early centuries, attempting to claim the Stoic as a secret ally of the faith. The Stoic emphasis on virtue, self-control, and acceptance of gods well resonated with Christian teachings. Over time, many Stoic ideas were absorbed into Christian thought, often without attribution. The painted porch faded, but its colors bled into something larger. Fact 66. During the Renaissance, as Europe rediscovered classical texts, Stoicism found new readers. The essayist Michel de Montaigne kept a copy of Seneca on his desk and filled his writing with Stoic reflections on death, friendship, and the art of living. Petrarch, the Italian poet and scholar, engaged deeply with Stoic ideas about virtue and fortune. The Renaissance humanists were drawn to Stoicism not as a dogma, but as a conversation partner, a source of practical insight about how to live. In their hands, the ancient philosophy became something more personal, more literary, less systematic. It was no longer a school. It was a sensibility, a way of thinking that could sit alongside other commitments and enrich them. Fact 67. Not everyone admired the Stoics. Friedrich Nietzsche, the German philosopher of the 19th century, had sharp words for them. He accused the Stoics of trying to impose their own idea of order onto a chaotic universe, of pretending that nature follows human reason. You want to live according to nature? Nietzsche wrote, "You are tyrants who would make nature conform to your own image." And yet even Nietzsche did not dismiss Stoicism entirely. He respected its demand for self-mastery and its refusal to complain. His own concept of amor fati, the love of fate, draws directly from Stoic roots. Nietzsche fought the Stoics, but he also learned from them. Sometimes the sharpest critics are the ones who have listened most carefully. Fact 68. Admiral James Stockdale was a U.S. Navy pilot shot down over Vietnam in 1965. He spent more than 7 years as a prisoner of war, much of it in solitary confinement, much of it enduring torture. Years earlier, as a young officer, he had studied philosophy at Stanford, and he had come across the writings of Epictetus. In the prison camp, Epictetus became his lifeline. The dichotomy of control was no longer an abstract idea. It was a survival mechanism. Stockdale could not control his captors. He could not control the pain. But he could control his response, his refusal to be broken, his determination to maintain his integrity. He later said that Stoicism saved his life and his sanity. Not in theory, in practice, in a small dirty cell on the other side of the world. Fact 69. Today, Stoicism has found an audience far beyond philosophy departments. CEOs in high-pressure boardrooms read Marcus Aurelius to steady their nerves. Professional athletes use Stoic principles to focus on performance rather than results. Military special forces incorporate Stoic resilience training into their preparation. This widespread adoption has brought new attention to the philosophy, but it has also raised a question: is Stoicism being turned into a productivity tool? The ancient Stoics would likely have mixed feelings. They valued effectiveness, but they valued character more. Using Stoicism to make more money or win more games is not the same as using it to become a better human being. The tension remains alive, and each modern practitioner must resolve it for themselves. Fact 70. Stoicism is no longer a single school with a single leader. It has become a global community of individuals, connected by books, podcasts, online forums, and annual events like Stoic Week. In cities around the world, people gather in small groups to discuss the old texts and how they apply to modern life. The subreddit dedicated to Stoicism has hundreds of thousands of members who share questions, reflections, and struggles. The ancient porch has become a digital one, a virtual stoa, where anyone with an internet connection can step in and listen. The format has changed, but the dynamic is recognizable. Strangers coming together in a shared space to ask how to live well. Fact 71. Stoicism and Epicureanism are often mentioned together, two philosophical schools that emerged in the same period of Greek history and asked similar questions, but their answers differed in important ways. The Epicureans, following their founder Epicurus, believed that the goal of life was pleasure, not indulgence or excess, but a quiet state of contentment, free from pain and fear. They valued friendship, simple living, and withdrawal from public life. The Stoics, by contrast, believed that the goal was virtue, not pleasure. Pleasure might come as a byproduct of a good life, but it was not the target. And where the Epicureans often retreated from politics and civic duty, the Stoics engaged with them. The two schools respected each other, but disagreed on the fundamentals. Both sought peace. They just walked different paths toward it, paths that sometimes crossed in the quiet of a shared evening. Fact 72. Stoicism and Buddhism, separated by vast geography and different cultural roots, share some remarkable similarities. Both traditions teach that suffering comes from attachment, from clinging to things that are impermanent. Both teach that freedom is found in letting go. Both emphasize mindfulness, the practice of observing one's own mind without being swept away by every thought. But there are differences as well. Buddhism speaks of rebirth and karma in ways that Stoicism does not. Stoicism places a strong emphasis on rational judgment and civic duty that is less central in Buddhist thought. The two traditions are not the same, but they arrive at insights that resonate across the distance, like two instruments tuned to a similar frequency. Fact 73. Stoicism grew out of cynicism, and the family resemblance is still visible. The cynics, like Diogenes, rejected social conventions entirely. They lived in the streets, owned almost nothing, and spoke blunt truths to anyone who would listen. They were the rebels of the ancient philosophical world. Zeno, the founder of Stoicism, studied under the Cynic Crates and absorbed the Cynic commitment to simplicity and honesty. But Zeno moderated the message. He believed you could live a philosophical life without abandoning society, without shocking your neighbors, without sleeping in a barrel. Stoicism is sometimes described as cynicism made civilized, a rebel impulse dressed in ordinary clothes. The fire is still there, but it burns lower, steadier, warm enough to live by without consuming everything around it. Fact 74. The Stoic idea of living according to nature has a distant echo in Taoism, the ancient Chinese tradition associated with Laozi and Zhuangzi. The Taoist concept of Wu Wei, often translated as effortless action or non-forcing, suggests that the wise person moves with the current of things rather than against it. This sounds remarkably like the Stoic advice to accept fate rather than resist it. But the underlying worldviews differ. Taoism sees the universe as a spontaneous organic flow that defies rational categorization. Stoicism sees it as an ordered, rational structure governed by the logos. One trusts the mystery, the other trusts the reason. Yet both arrive at a similar posture, a kind of gentle alignment with reality, a softening of the urge to control. Fact 75. Stoicism and Christianity have a long and tangled history. When the early Christians began to articulate their faith in the Roman world, they found in Stoicism a ready-made vocabulary for talking about virtue, self-control, and the order of the universe. The Gospel of John opens with the word, the logos, a term that Stoic philosophy had already saturated with meaning. Later Christian thinkers, from Augustine to Aquinas, engaged seriously with Stoic ethics. The main point of divergence was grace. Stoicism held that human beings could achieve virtue through their own rational effort. Christianity insisted that human effort alone was not enough, that divine grace was necessary. This disagreement did not prevent centuries of fruitful exchange. The two traditions borrowed from each other, argued with each other, and in the process enriched each other. Fact 76. Existentialism, the 20th century philosophy associated with Jean-Paul Sartre and Albert Camus, shares some dark and honest ground with Stoicism. Both traditions acknowledge that life can be difficult, absurd, and painful. Both insist that human beings must find meaning without relying on easy answers from outside. But the mood is different. Stoicism finds comfort in the rational order of the universe. Existentialism looks at the same universe and sees no inherent order at all, only the raw fact of existence and the burden of freedom. The Stoic says, the world has meaning and you are part of it. The existentialist says, the world has no meaning until you create it. Both are trying to answer the same question, how to live authentically, but the silence after the question sounds different in each tradition. Fact 77. Seneca and Marcus Aurelius are the two most widely read Stoic writers today, and they make an interesting pair. Seneca was a playwright, a rhetorician, a man of public performance. His letters and essays are polished, crafted for an audience, full of wit and literary flair. Marcus wrote only for himself, in fragments, without concern for style or reception. Seneca is the voice you hear in a lecture hall, eloquent and persuasive. Marcus is the voice you overhear in the next room, mumbling to himself in the dark. Both are honest in their own ways, but Seneca's honesty is shaped for others, while Marcus's honesty is almost accidental. Different readers are drawn to different voices. Neither is the whole picture of Stoicism, but together they form a kind of harmony. Fact 78. Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius never met. Epictetus died before Marcus was born. But Marcus read Epictetus, and the influence is visible throughout the Meditations. A teacher and an emperor, separated by time and station, connected by a shared philosophy. Epictetus was the former slave who taught that freedom was an inner condition. Marcus was the ruler of the known world who spent his life trying to internalize that very lesson. The contrast is striking, but the continuity is more striking still. The same ideas that helped a former slave endure his hardships also helped an emperor bear the weight of an empire. Philosophy, when it is genuine, does not care about your position. It speaks to anyone who is willing to listen. Fact 79. Modern Stoicism is not identical to ancient Stoicism, and the differences are worth noting. Most modern practitioners focus almost entirely on ethics, on the practical techniques for living well. The ancient Stoics embedded their ethics within a larger system that included physics and logic. They believed that understanding the cosmos was essential to understanding how to live. Modern Stoicism has largely set aside the physics and the logic, partly because science has moved on, partly because people today are looking for practical tools rather than comprehensive worldviews. This is not necessarily a problem. A philosophy must speak to its time. But it is worth remembering that the ancient Stoics were after something larger than stress management. They were trying to understand the whole of existence, and ethics was only one piece of that puzzle. Fact 80. Stoicism has a complicated relationship with popular culture. In films like Gladiator, in countless motivational videos and social media posts, Stoicism is often reduced to a single image: the strong, silent man who endures without complaint. This version of Stoicism is incomplete, but it is not entirely wrong. The Stoics did value resilience. They did teach that complaining is useless, but they also valued compassion, community, and the honest expression of feeling. The popular image captures the surface and misses the depth. It mistakes the posture for the philosophy. A real Stoic is not a statue. A real Stoic is someone who has learned, through patient practice, to move through the world with both strength and softness, with both discipline and warmth. The challenge for modern Stoicism is to tell that fuller story, to let the caricature give way to something more human. Fact 81. Before Zeno became a philosopher, before the shipwreck, before the painted porch, he was a merchant who traded in purple dye. In the ancient world, purple was the color of power. The dye was extracted from sea snails, thousands of them crushed to produce a single gram of pigment. Only the wealthiest could afford purple cloth. Zeno's cargo, the one he lost at sea, was likely worth a small fortune. The irony is quiet but unmistakable. The man who would later teach that wealth is indifferent, that possessions are not worth clinging to, began his adult life surrounded by one of the most expensive substances in the ancient world. He lost it all and gained something that no shipwreck could take from him. Fact 82. Cleanthes, the water carrier who became head of the Stoic school, left behind a poem known as the Hymn to Zeus. It is one of the oldest surviving Stoic texts, and it reads differently from the practical advice of Epictetus or the introspective notes of Marcus Aurelius. Cleanthes addresses Zeus as a divine presence, the embodiment of the Logos, the reason that guides the cosmos. He asks Zeus to lead him willingly, and adds that even if he resists, he will still be led. The poem is a prayer, but it is not a plea for special favors. It is an expression of trust in the order of things. A man who had spent his life in labor and study, writing on oyster shells by candlelight, lifting his voice to the universe and saying, in essence, I am willing to follow. Fact 83. Chrysippus is not a name that appears on motivational posters. He does not have a popular English translation in airport bookshops, but in the ancient world his reputation was immense. He was the one who took the scattered insights of Zeno and Clinthus and built them into a coherent system. He developed the logic of propositions, the theory of emotions, the arguments against rival schools. He wrote so much that later critics accused him of being repetitive, of filling pages with quotations from other authors. But his thoroughness saved Stoicism. When the skeptical academy challenged Stoic ideas, Chrysippus had an answer ready. He was the architect working behind the scenes, and the structure he built stood for centuries. His words are mostly gone now, but their shape remains visible in everything that came after. Fact 84. Marcus Aurelius had 14 children with his wife Faustina. Only a handful survived to adulthood. The others died in infancy or childhood, taken by illnesses that modern medicine would treat easily. Marcus wrote about death so often in the Meditations not as an abstract exercise, but because he had seen it up close. He had held his own children as they slipped away. He had stood by small graves. When he wrote that life is brief, that loss is inevitable, that we must cherish what we have while we have it, he was not repeating a philosophical cliché. He was speaking from the deepest wound a person can know. The Meditations is not the work of a detached thinker. It is the work of a father who kept losing children, and still managed somehow to affirm that life was worth living. Fact 85. Seneca spent 8 years in exile on the island of Corsica. He was sent there by the Emperor Claudius, accused of adultery with a member of the imperial family. The charge may have been politically motivated. The isolation was real either way. Corsica was not a place of culture or comfort. It was rugged, remote, a long way from the Senate and the literary circles Seneca had known in Rome. He wrote letters and essays from that exile, and some of them reveal a man struggling to practice what he preached. He begged for permission to return. He flattered the emperor's freedmen. He was not always the model Stoic, but he also wrote honestly about time, about loss, about the inner resources that remain when everything external is stripped away. He learned something in those 8 years. Not perfection, but something closer to humility. Fact 86. Everything we know about Epictetus comes to us second-hand. He wrote nothing himself. His teachings were preserved by a student named Arrian, who attended his lectures in Nicopolis and took extensive notes. Arrian later compiled these notes into the Discourses and a short handbook called the Enchiridion. In his preface, Arrian admits that he cannot capture the full force of Epictetus's spoken words. The tone of voice, the intensity, the way he would challenge a student directly. What we have is an echo, a transcription, filtered through a devoted but imperfect listener. And yet that echo has been enough to change lives for nearly 2,000 years. Epictetus himself might have smiled at this. He taught that we work with what we have, not with what we wish we had. An imperfect record is still a record, and it has carried his voice far beyond anything he could have imagined. Fact 87. The book we call the Meditations was not given that title by its author. Marcus Aurelius did not name it at all. The original Greek manuscripts were headed with a simple phrase, ta is hoton, which means to himself. The title Meditations was attached much later by editors and translators who wanted to give the work a name that would make sense to readers. But the original heading tells us something important. This was not a book written for an audience. It was a private practice, a written conversation between a man and his own soul. The words were not composed. They were exhaled quietly in the pauses between duties. Every time we read it, we are listening in on a dialogue that was never meant to include us. Fact 88. The Stoic tradition includes women whose stories are often overlooked. One of the most striking is Portia Catonis, the daughter of Cato the Younger. She was raised in a household where Stoic principles were lived, not just discussed. She married Brutus, one of the conspirators against Julius Caesar. After Brutus fled Rome and eventually died, Portia was left alone in a hostile political environment. According to the ancient accounts, she chose to end her own life rather than be captured. The method reported is difficult to read. She is said to have swallowed hot coals. Historians debate whether this detail is literal or symbolic, but the story points to something real. Portia was remembered as a woman of extraordinary resolve, a Stoic in her own right, who absorbed her father's philosophy and lived it to the very end. Her name is quieter than the men's names, but it belongs in the same record. Fact 89. Between the early Stoa of Zeno and the late Stoa of Marcus Aurelius, there was a middle period centered on the island of Rhodes. The leading figure was Posidonius, a philosopher whose interests ranged from astronomy to geography to ethics. He traveled widely, gathering observations about the tides, the stars, and the customs of different peoples. He believed that philosophy should be informed by empirical research, not just abstract reasoning. His school attracted students from across the Mediterranean, including prominent Romans who would later bring Stoic ideas back to the capital. The Middle Stoa is less famous than the earlier and later periods, but it was a bridge. Without Posidonius and his generation, Stoicism might not have made the journey from Greece to Rome, from a local school to a worldview that shaped an empire. Fact 90. In the city of Herculaneum, buried by the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 CE, a villa was discovered containing a library of carbonized papyrus scrolls. Among these scrolls, scholars have identified works by Chrysippus and other Stoic writers. The scrolls are blackened, fragile, almost impossible to unroll without destroying them. But new imaging technologies and artificial intelligence are beginning to read them to detect traces of ink on the charred surfaces. Some of the lost books of Stoicism may yet be recovered, word by painstaking word, from the ash of a volcano that erupted nearly 2,000 years ago. The philosophy that began on a painted porch in Athens may have more to say to us still, waiting in the dark of a buried library, patient as stone. Fact 91. The legacy of Stoicism is not really a collection of books or a set of arguments. It is something quieter and harder to measure. It lives in the moments when a person, facing something difficult, pauses before reacting. It lives in the small breath before an angry word is swallowed. It lives in the choice to focus on what can be changed and release what cannot. These moments do not make headlines. They do not win awards, but they accumulate over a lifetime, shaping a character, steadying a mind. The books are just the vessels. The real legacy is carried inside people who have never written a word of philosophy, who have never stood in a lecture hall, but who have learned, through patient practice, to meet the world with a little more clarity and a little less fear. Fact 92. When the Stoic school officially ended, when the last formal teacher closed the last formal lesson, the ideas did not die. They seeped into the culture like water into soil. They reappeared in Christian monastic traditions, in Renaissance essays, in the quiet advice of grandparents who had never heard of Zeno, but who told their children not to worry about things they could not control. A philosophy does not need a building or a name to survive. It needs only to be useful, to speak to something real in human experience. Stoicism has survived for over 2,000 years not because it is clever, but because it is true in a way that ordinary people, in ordinary moments, can recognize and hold on to. Fact 93. Perhaps the most beautiful thing about Stoicism is that it does not ask you to become someone else. It does not demand that you transform into a sage overnight. It only asks you to become a little more like the person you already are when you are at your best. The calm you. The patient you. The you who can take a deep breath and remember what matters. Stoicism is not a costume you put on. It is a way of clearing away the noise so that your own best instincts can surface. The wisdom is not imported from outside. It is uncovered from within, like a floor swept clean after a long neglect. Fact 94. As the night settles around you, consider this quiet thought. Most of the things you are worrying about tonight will not happen. And if they do happen, you will handle them. You have handled difficult things before. You have survived days you thought you could not survive. The future is not a fixed and terrifying thing rushing toward you. It is a series of moments that will arrive one at a time, each one manageable on its own. The Stoics knew this. They knew that the imagination is often the source of more suffering than reality. Let the future stay where it is in the hours ahead. Right now, in this moment, there is nothing you need to solve. Fact 95. Picture Marcus Aurelius in his tent on the northern frontier. Late at night, the camp settling into silence around him. The day's decisions are done. The generals have gone to their quarters. The soldiers are sleeping. He is alone with a small lamp and a notebook. He writes a few lines to himself. Reminders about patience, about kindness, about not being angry with difficult people. He is the most powerful man in the known world, and he is reminding himself to be gentle. The words are not for history. They are for the next morning, when the pressures will begin again. He sets the pen down, extinguishes the lamp, and lets the darkness hold him. Even an emperor in the end is just a person trying to rest well so that he can face another day. Fact 96. Here is a question you do not need to answer, only to carry softly into sleep. What, right now, is genuinely within your control? Not the weather tomorrow, not the decisions of other people, not the past, which has already happened, not the future, which has not arrived. What is within your control in this exact moment is your attention, your breath, the way you hold your body against the mattress, the willingness to let go of a thought that is not serving you. That is not a small list. It is the only list that has ever mattered, and it is entirely yours. Fact 97. And one more question, even softer than the first. If this moment were enough, would you know it? Or are you still reaching for something else, some future condition that must be met before you allow yourself to rest? The Stoics believed that peace was available right now, not after the promotion, not after the apology, not after the resolution of every problem. Right now, in this quiet room, with the day behind you and the night ahead, everything you need for contentment is already present. The room does not need to be different. Your life does not need to be different. You only need to notice that, for this moment, It is already enough. Fact 98. Do not try to answer these questions. Do not try to solve them. Let them drift across your mind like clouds moving over a still lake. They are not tasks. They are not tests. They are just quiet invitations left here for you to pick up or ignore as you wish. The Stoics would be the first to say that philosophy, in the end, is not about winning arguments or proving points. It is about finding a way to be at peace in the world as it actually is. And sometimes that means letting thoughts go rather than holding on to them. Let them go now gently without effort. The ideas have done their work. They can rest, and so can you. Fact 99. Epictetus, the former slave, who became a teacher, left behind a sentence that has traveled across nearly 2,000 years to reach this moment. Do not seek to have events happen as you want them to, but instead want them to happen as they do happen, and your life will go well. This is not a call to passivity. It is not a surrender. It is a recognition that the universe does not consult us before it moves. The only path to peace is to align our will with what is, rather than exhausting ourselves, fighting what cannot be changed. The words are simple. The practice is the work of a lifetime. But even a small step in this direction, even a moment of genuine acceptance, can feel like a weight lifted from the shoulders. Let the sentence settle. It asks nothing more of you tonight. Fact 100. As the final idea settles, there is nothing more you need to do. You have traveled through 100 quiet thoughts, from a painted porch in ancient Athens to a tent on a Roman frontier, from the words of a slave to the writings of an emperor. They all point in their different ways toward the same simple truth. You already have what you need to be steady. The stillness you are looking for is not somewhere else. It is here, in this room, in this breath, in this moment of quiet, between the day that has passed and the day that will come. Let the thoughts grow softer now. Let the room be enough. Let this moment be enough. It already is. And now, with nothing left to remember, and nowhere else to be, let the quiet carry you. Thank you for resting with the Sleep Library tonight. Sleep well and good night.